Hi everybody, welcome to Newton Community Farm. My name's Hope and it's Wednesday, so we're going to be talking about farming and gardening. It's August now, we just turned the corner on August, and the hot dog days are definitely here and production is definitely booming at Newton Community Farm and hopefully in your growing spaces as well. And today I thought it would be worthwhile to check in and see what kind of adjustments we can make in the beginning of this month to clear out our gardens of any plants that are diseased, any plants that aren't producing anymore, and then think about and talk about and look at what kind of crops we can plant now, because it's mid-summer, I would say, but we still have plenty of time to get new crops in the ground. So at Newton Community Farm in August, we're still doing a fair amount of planting. So some of that is seeding and some of that is transplanting. And in August, we plant a lot of quick growing crops like cut lettuces and heads of lettuce. We do arugula and beets. We do radish and turnip. So there's a lot on the short season side of the list. And then we're also getting ready to plant our fall brassicas. So things like fall broccoli, fall kale, and those crops that we're hoping will be producing into the fall. So a little bit of longer season crops that will be transplanted into the ground at some point this month, so that in the fall we'll still have plenty of food coming off the farm. So I thought we could start our walk around today by checking out the greenhouse and seeing what the greenhouse looks like in August. So if you've ever visited us in a regular year when folks can come by and see the farm, you may have seen the greenhouse in spring. And so in spring, that's our really big push for planting. And on any farm and in any garden, that's the big push for planting, is as soon as spring's here, we want to have all of our transplants ready to go into the ground. So things like kale and chard, that won't be direct seeded, they'll be transplanted. Those will grow up from seed in seed trays in the greenhouse. And in mid-May, we did our seedling sale. So in mid-May, we had tons and tons of seedlings just like filling up the greenhouse. And it was a really exciting time, the beginning of that push. And we have co-hosts today. The seedling sale was an exciting time, beginning of the season. Greenhouse was totally loaded with seedlings. And now it's not that loaded, so we have a lot fewer trays. Like I said, some of the things we're planting in August will be direct seeded, so they don't have to go through the greenhouse system. But some things are still going to be growing up in here to be transplanted out to the field. So I thought we could look at a few of those right now. So in this corner we have just a variety of lettuces. So these are Adriana lettuce, and these are all transplants that will be put out into the field at some point this month. So typically when the seedlings are a little bit bigger than this, they'll be ready to be transplanted out into the field. So if you take kind of like a zoom out look at the greenhouse, it's not very full at all. And I think that's kind of par for the course for us, at least, with August planting. Here's our fall broccoli. And that'll grow a little bit more before going out into the field. But in the spring, when we're getting ready to fill the fields to the brim, this is completely full. There's no room at all on these shelves. And things are always being shuffled around to make room for new trees. So if you've seen a greenhouse that full, or if you can imagine this greenhouse that full, it's pretty different right now with August planting. There's just a few trays, and everything else is either in the field or will be direct seeded into the field pretty soon. So that's stop number one. Checking out our broccoli and our lettuce, all getting ready to be planted. So broccoli has a much longer lifespan than these lettuce will. So the lettuce will be a quicker season crop. Something great to plant if you're hoping to put your garden to sleep in early fall. For a production farm like ours, we're going to want to have some longer season crops like broccoli to just continue producing as long as we can into the fall season. So in the learning garden, we'll kind of do a little walk around and look at what sort of things are ready to be pulled out. And some of the considerations with what you are pulling out of the ground include, what isn't producing anymore. So we'll walk around and see what's still fruiting or producing green leaves or continuing to grow and give us food. And there are definitely some things in the learning garden that are past that point. Their lifespan's done, they're not really producing anymore. And those are great options for things to pull out of the ground to make space for something new. And then if you're noticing some diseased leaves or some completely diseased plants, it's a good idea to just pull those up, get them out of the ground away from your other plants, and remember not to compost them if you are composting at home. And another consideration before you start planting, and we'll talk a little bit more about planting after we walk around, is whether or not you want to use cover crops in your garden over the fall and winter. And cover cropping is something that we'll dive into at length in a few future episodes, probably later this month. But if you're thinking about cover cropping, which is basically rather than planting a crop for food and for production, it's a crop that's planted simply to replenish some nutrients into the soil. So here we use things like oats and peas and rye and vetch, and we'll talk all about those in future episodes. But if you're thinking about cover cropping, it's good to know where you might be cover cropping in your growing space and refrain from planting anything that's longer season like broccoli that might get in the way of your planting schedule with those crops. But more on that later. Now we'll do a little walk around in the learning garden. And we'll look at what is still producing, and we'll look at what has kind of petered out and isn't really producing anymore. So over here, this is kind of like the nightshade corner, I would say. We have lunchbox peppers here. And as you can see, there's a lot of fruit on the plants. They're coming in green. And sooner or later, they'll all start ripening up like this one. And they're right next door to the cherry tomatoes, which if you've watched future or past episodes rather, you've seen that they've had a pretty long and strenuous journey in this garden. But now they're all trellised. And tomatoes, if they're healthy and happy, they'll keep producing through the summer. So plants like peppers and tomatoes are really starting to boom at this time of year in New England. So these are plants that will definitely be staying in the learning garden for the time being. And there's some pretty beautiful tomatoes that I'm just eager to show, I guess. These beautiful green and purple mesmerizing tomatoes. We'll see what color they turn into. There's a whole mix of varieties in here, and I'm not sure which is which anymore. So as you can see, probably like your growing space, there's still a lot of life, and August is a very exciting time to be at a farm or to visit a garden and see what's going. But a lot of spring crops aren't really going anymore. So we'll look at some of those. I have a number of plants over here that have just kind of stopped producing. And then a number of plants on this side that are a little bit diseased. So we'll look at the diseased plants first since we're right next to it. At the edge of the nightshade area over here, I have some squash plants planted. And these are patty pans, so these look like little flying saucers, kind of. And as you can see, this one is still producing and it's pretty healthy. And I'm still able to go through and kind of harvest from these plants. And they're still flowering, which is a great sign. And despite some browning on the stem, they're still pretty healthy. But next door, their neighbors aren't as happy. So these, I believe, are different varieties. I don't remember which, but they never really produced to the capacity that these plants did. I think I got like a few pieces of fruit from them, but not much. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of disease on these leaves. And I don't have too much faith that they'll rebound. and I don't want their disease to spread in any way to these healthy plants or to incorporate into the soil and become a problem in future growing seasons. So my plan for these plants is to just kind of pull them right out and not compost them and dispose of them another way. They have a pretty long root. And in a small growing space or in a home garden, it's really no problem to take a few plants out and then add something new over here. You know, we can kind of turn our spaces into a mosaic of some sort, but in the production side of things, on a field like ours, where we're growing food at the highest capacity that we can, we tend to clear entire beds at once. So if we had a few diseased plants and mostly healthy plants, we'd probably just keep the bed there. Whereas if we had a lot of plants that weren't doing well, we'd probably try to clear them all. So I think with smaller growing spaces, they tend to lend themselves well to picking out a few plants, and then half this bed will be something new and half will be healthy squash plants. So kind of depends on the size of your growing space, the approach that you might want to take. But for me, I will be removing both of these plants as part of my August cleanup. And I'll come back and get rid of those. And we'll see what else we can add to the space. So let's walk over and see some plants that aren't necessarily diseased, but are just not really producing anymore. They've reached the end of their lifespan and it's time to pull them out of the ground. So we have chard here that is technically the spring chard. It was planted late spring and it's still producing, and I'm gonna leave it in the ground. But I'd say it's definitely slowing down, and this leaf is no good anymore. It's definitely slowing down. Typically chard can be this big, really bushy plant, but these are still producing new leaves, and we're trying to grow as much food as we can, especially this season. So I'll leave this in for a while, and I'll see how the kale and chard continue to do. But on this side, I have some bean plants that I have gotten some fruit from, but they're pretty much done. So you can see these two here. And typically I wouldn't spread my beans out with that much space between them, but I actually had pretty spotty germination with my seeding in this bed. So there's kind of these big, strange gaps, which happens. So as you can see, these plants are just kind of like browning and starting to get brittle, and there's no signs of any real flowers, or well, there's one, but there's no signs of much more production coming. So I'll go through this bed and I'll clear it out. And even though there's one at the far end that's still kind of producing, I won't leave this bed with all this exposed soil for just one plant. It's better to clear the whole bed out and get some kind of root system into the soil to help keep it all intact and keep all those nutrients in the ground. And for this space, because we've kind of turned the bed over, there's not much being produced in this section of the learning garden besides these greens. I'm already looking ahead to what can I add for cover crop just to replenish this part of the garden, this part of the soil. So again, we'll talk about that in future episodes, but for now, I'm not actually adding any new crop to this section. I'm just gonna get ready to cover crop in the next few weeks or by the end of the month. So I'll leave these in the ground for now until I'm ready to put something else in there, because they're not gonna damage anything. They're not diseased, but yeah, I'll take them out when I'm ready to plant. So speaking of planting, we'll do a little bit of that right now. So in this raised bed over here, I have ambitions to keep planting quick season greens into these raised beds. There won't be any cover crop going in here, and raised beds are a good place to put your greens. So my plan, so I cleared this out. This had some violas, this had some cilantro, and this had some head lettuce. So it's already given us some production this season. So my plan is to, the soil's already empty and ready for a new planting. But because it's given us flowers and herbs and greens already, I'm gonna add a little bit of compost to it, especially since it's raised bed soil, so just naturally not gonna be as rich as the soil that we have on the farm. So yeah, this has already been cleared of all of the root structures of the last plants that were in here. And I'm going to plant arugula, which is one of my favorite greens, and it tends to get spicy in really hot heat. But because we're kind of turning the corner on these like super hot days, hopefully the heat's gonna break soon, it's a great green to plant as we're heading into fall. And it will take, let's see the germination time. It will take about 20 to 40 days, 21 for baby cuts, 40 for full size. So by the end of August, we'll hopefully have some greens growing in here. All right, so we'll sprinkle some compost on first. These are always tricky. Technical difficulties. Okay, we'll just cut the side. So I'll just grab a few handfuls of this, just kind of sprinkle it on top. You can add as much or as little as you'd like to, but kind of just giving a little top layer of compost to the soil will help to replenish anything that those previous plants had kind of taken out and extracted in terms of nutrients. So because this is a raised bed and the soil is like very fine, I'm just gonna kind of mix this in with my hands. If I were working in a bed like those beds over there where the beans are, or behind me where all the nightshades are, I might use like a rake. I might use a broad fork, depending on how incorporated I'd like these amendments to be. And if you find anything that you don't really want, like an old root, you can just kind of toss that out. And then depending on how far apart the seed packet calls for the seeds to be, you can, if you're transplanting, you can dig all your holes beforehand so you can mark out where you want your transplants to be. For me, I'm going to use my trowel as like a little shovel, and I'm just going to create a furrow for my seeds here. And these seeds are called for being about 1/8 of an inch deep, so this might even be a little bit deeper than we need. But I'll create all these furrows side by side, giving a little space between each row. It'll make it a little less wild when harvest time comes along. And you can follow the seed packet directions as closely as you'd like to. With direct seeding, sometimes the seeding can be spotty, or sometimes it won't take that well, especially when done by hand, as opposed to a seeding machine, which we tend to use in the field for really uniform germination. But for me, I'm just gonna sprinkle into the furrow, and I'm probably gonna go a little bit heavier than the seed packet calls for. And I'm just gonna fill in these furrows with these little arugula seeds. And once I'm done, I'll make sure that this bed gets a little bit of water, just so these seeds can be incorporated and cared for right away. And as you can see, I'm seeding pretty heavy, but I definitely want to make sure that I get a stand at some point from this planting. So I'll put back the extras, probably adding some dirt too. And then I'll go ahead and just kind of fill this furrow back in, gently brushing dirt on top of the seeds. And then I'll tamp it down a little bit. And that's it. And I'll continue on right now, probably, in all these furrows, continuing on through the bed. And because arugulas can be pretty prone to pests, I'll probably actually add a thin layer of some kind of row cover to this bed. And as the arugula grows, it'll fill in the row cover and protect it from certain pests. And then once that arugula reaches closer to maturity, I'll be sure to take that row cover off so that no pests make their home inside of it. It's kind of like a double-edged sword, that use of row cover. So that's the extent of planting. So to kind of recap, I'm spending this very first chunk of August going through my growing space, seeing what isn't producing anymore, seeing what might be diseased and should just come out of the soil. And then I'm thinking about cover crops, and I'm adding in some new shorter season crops in the spaces that I've already cleared out. And that's the extent of the August check-in. We're here every Wednesday, so do check back in next week, and we'll see you then. Bye.